Dust devils danced across the parched earth, mimicking the turmoil in Jackson, Creekwater Jack, Stone's soul. He wasn't Creekwater Jack anymore, not officially. The newspapers, the wanted posters, they were relics of a past he desperately tried to bury beneath layers of respectable irrigation schematics and quiet diligence. Now he was just Jack Stone, the man who understood water. His hands, once quick on the draw, were now calloused from turning valves and coaxing life from the dry land. But the ghosts lingered, whispering in the wind that snaked through the canyons. He saw the fear in the eyes of the villagers of Santa Maria, the way they flinched when he walked by, the hushed tones that followed him. They knew his history, the stories embellished and passed down through generations. He was a specter of violence in their peaceful valley. He lived on the outskirts, a small, sun-baked adobe house, his only companion besides the endless calculations and flow charts that consumed his days. The only sound at night was the creaking of the wind and the distant howl of coyotes, sounds that mirrored the loneliness that gnawed at him. He had come to this valley seeking anonymity, a place to disappear. He had offered his skills, knowing they desperately needed someone who understood the capricious nature of the river. He had hoped his work would speak for itself, that he could slowly earn their trust. But trust was a fragile thing, especially when built on a foundation of fear and regret. Creekwater Jack was a legend, a boogeyman used to scare children. Jack Stone was a man trying to atone, to build something instead of destroy. The river, which was both their lifeblood and a potential source of devastation, was his only confidant. He knew its moods, its rhythms, its hidden currents. He understood its power, a power that could nourish or destroy. He often stood on the banks, watching the water flow, imagining the faces of those he had wronged. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could shape the future. He could use his knowledge, his skills, to protect this village, to finally earn the redemption he craved. But the opportunity to prove himself had not yet arrived. The villagers saw the outlaw still, and he was stuck in that role unless something changed drastically. Santa Maria was a place time forgot, or perhaps a place time deliberately overlooked. Nestled deep within a valley carved by centuries of relentless river flow, it was a tapestry of sun-baked adobe, vibrant bougainvillea, and the ever-present murmur of the water. The village was small, a cluster of houses clinging to the fertile banks, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the river. Fields of corn and beans stretched out like a green quilt, providing sustenance and a sense of continuity. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust, wildflowers, and wood smoke, a comforting aroma that spoke of simple lives and enduring traditions. Children played in the dusty streets, their laughter echoing against the canyon walls. Old men sat on porches, whittling wood and sharing stories of the past. Women tended to their gardens, their hands stained with earth and their faces etched with the wisdom of generations. The river was everything to Santa Maria. It provided water for their crops, sustenance for their families, and a connection to the world beyond the valley. But it was also a source of fear, a reminder of nature's unpredictable power. The elders spoke of devastating floods that had swept through the valley, wiping out homes and claiming lives. The river gave, but it could also take away, and the villagers lived with a constant awareness of its potential for destruction. Their church, a small adobe structure with a weathered bell tower, stood as a testament to their faith and resilience. Inside, candles flickered before the altar, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The villagers gathered there every Sunday, seeking solace and strength in their shared beliefs. Life in Santa Maria was hard, but it was also good. There was a sense of community, a feeling of belonging that was rare in the outside world. People knew each other, helped each other, and shared each other's burdens. They were a close-knit group, bound together by their shared history and their dependence on the river. But even in this idyllic setting, the shadow of Creekwater Jack loomed large. He was a reminder of the violence and chaos that existed beyond their valley, a symbol of the dangers that lurked in the outside world. They watched him warily, unsure of his intentions, hoping that his past wouldn't come back to haunt them. They were a peaceful people, content with their simple lives, and they feared the disruption that Creekwater Jack might bring. They were like sheep, and he, the wolf, even if he now wore sheep's clothing. The summer air usually crackled with heat, but this year it felt different. Heavier, more oppressive. The sun beat down with a relentless intensity, baking the earth to a crisp, but the usual afternoon thunderstorms that brought relief never materialized. The sky remained a brassy, unsettling yellow. The animals seemed to sense it, too. The birds, usually so vocal, had fallen silent. The cattle huddled together in the shade, restless and uneasy. Even the normally skittish deer seemed to be drawn closer to the village, seeking some kind of unspoken reassurance. Old man Rodriguez, the village elder, noticed it first. He sat on his porch, his weathered face etched with concern, watching the sky. "The mountain is angry," he muttered, his voice raspy with age. "I haven't seen a sky like this since the great flood of '32. Others dismissed his fears as the ramblings of an old man, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Whispers of past disasters began to circulate through the village. Stories of the river's fury, of homes swept away and lives lost, were recounted with a renewed sense of urgency. Jack Stone felt it too, a prickling unease beneath his skin. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the subtle signs of impending danger. The air was too still, the silence too profound. The river, usually a steady, predictable flow, had become erratic, its currents shifting and swirling in unpredictable ways. He climbed to the highest point overlooking the valley, his eyes scanning the horizon. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in a hazy mist. He knew the dam, built years ago to control the river's flow, was up there. He had studied its blueprints, familiarizing himself with its strengths and weaknesses. He knew the dam was old, its concrete weakened by years of exposure to the elements. He also knew that a prolonged drought followed by a sudden, intense rainfall could create a catastrophic situation. The dam could fail, unleashing a torrent of water that would engulf Santa Maria in a matter of minutes. He returned to his adobe house, his mind racing. He had to warn them, but how could he convince them to believe him? They already distrusted him, saw him as a threat. Would they listen to the word of a former outlaw, or would they dismiss him as a crazy man? He looked at the sky. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds with streaks of blood red. Time was running out. The mountain was angry and Santa Maria was in its path. He had to do something. The storm hit with the ferocity of a wounded beast. It wasn't a gentle rain, a cleansing shower. It was a deluge, a violent onslaught from a sky gone mad. Forked lightning ripped through the darkness, illuminating the valley in stark, fleeting flashes. The thunder echoed off the canyon walls, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of Santa Maria. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the landscape, turning the streets into raging rivers. The river itself began to swell, its muddy waters churning and rising with alarming speed. Trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches snapping like twigs. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth. The intensity of the storm was unlike anything the villagers had ever experienced. Even old man Rodriguez, who had witnessed countless storms in his long life, was shaken. "This is it," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "The mountain is unleashing its fury." Panic began to spread through Santa Maria. People huddled in their homes, praying for the storm to pass. The children cried, terrified by the thunder and lightning. The adults tried to reassure them, but their own fear was palpable. Jack Stone stood outside his adobe house, his face grim. He watched the river rise, its waters encroaching on the lower-lying areas of the village. He knew that if the dam failed, this would be just the beginning. The real devastation was yet to come. He could feel the vibrations in the ground, a low, ominous rumble that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of the mountain weeping, of the dam straining against the immense pressure of the water. He had to act, and he had to act now. He couldn't wait any longer to warn the villagers. Even if they didn't believe him, he had to try. He ran towards the center of the village, shouting above the roar of the storm. The dam. The dam is going to break. You have to get to higher ground. His voice was barely audible above the thunder, but some of the villagers heard him. They peered out of their windows, their faces etched with disbelief and fear. Was he telling the truth? Was the dam really about to break? They looked at the river, its waters now lapping at their doorsteps. They looked at the sky, a swirling mass of dark clouds and blinding flashes of lightning. They didn't know what to believe, but they knew that something was terribly wrong. And in that moment of uncertainty, fear trumped distrust. They started to move, grabbing their children and a few precious belongings and heading towards the higher ground on the edge of the village. The race against the flood had begun. Even as he urged them to flee, Jack knew getting to higher ground wouldn't be enough if the dam truly failed. It wouldn't be a gradual flood. It would be a wall of water, a raging torrent capable of wiping Santa Maria off the map. He understood the engineering of that dam, the volume of water it held back, the sheer force that would be unleashed. He glanced towards the mountains, barely visible through the downpour. The lightning illuminated the peaks intermittently, and in those brief flashes he could see the unthinkable. Water cascading over the dam's crest, an unnatural waterfall where there should have been only solid concrete. The dam was at its breaking point. A cold dread washed over him. This wasn't just a flood, it was a catastrophe. He had to do something more, something drastic. But what? He couldn't simply stand by and watch the village be destroyed. Then a desperate idea sparked in his mind, a plan so audacious, so dangerous, it bordered on insane. But it was the only chance they had. He had to relieve the pressure on the dam, create an alternative path for the water, divert the flood away from Santa Maria. He knew of an old, abandoned spillway, a channel carved into the rock years ago but never fully completed. It was located on the other side of the mountain, a risky route that could redirect a significant portion of the water. If he could blast open the entrance to the spillway, he might just be able to save the village. But it was a long shot, a gamble with impossible odds. He would need explosives, tools, and a hell of a lot of luck. And he would have to do it alone, battling the storm and the treacherous terrain, with the clock ticking down to disaster. He looked back at the villagers, scrambling towards the hills, their faces pale with fear. He knew he couldn't ask them to help. They wouldn't understand his plan, and even if they did, they wouldn't trust him enough to risk their lives. This was his burden, his chance to finally atone for his past. He turned and ran in the opposite direction, towards his adobe house, towards the tools and explosives he had buried long ago, remnants of a life he had tried to leave behind. Creekwater Jack was about to make one last appearance, not as an outlaw, but as a savior. He knew it was a suicide mission, but he didn't care. He had to try. He had to save Santa Maria. The dam was ready to give way any moment now. He had no time to lose. Inside his small adobe, the air was thick with dust and the scent of forgotten things. He yanked up a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the tools of his former trade, blasting caps, dynamite, a rusty detonator, relics of a life he thought he'd buried. As he unwrapped the dynamite, his hands trembled. He hadn't touched these things in years. They felt foreign, dangerous, yet strangely familiar. A wave of memories washed over him, the thrill of the heist, the adrenaline rush of the chase, the cold, hard reality of violence. He pushed the memories aside. There was no time for regret, no time for self-pity. He had a job to do. He quickly gathered the explosives along with a pickaxe, a shovel, and a coil of rope. He stuffed everything into a battered canvas bag, his heart pounding in his chest. But a conflict raged within him. Was he doing the right thing? Was he just a fool, risking his life for people who despised him? He could just leave, disappear into the storm, and let fate take its course. No one would blame him. They would probably say he deserved it, but he couldn't. He couldn't turn his back on them, not this time. He had lived with the guilt of his past for too long. This was his chance to finally make amends, to prove that he was more than just Creekwater Jack the outlaw. He thought of the children of Santa Maria, their innocent faces filled with fear. He thought of old man Rodriguez, his weathered face etched with wisdom and worry. He thought of the entire village, their lives hanging in the balance. He couldn't let them down, he wouldn't let them down. He grabbed the canvas bag and stepped out into the storm. The wind howled in his ears, the rain lashed at his face, but he didn't flinch. He was Creekwater Jack, and he was on a mission. He started towards the mountains, his path illuminated by flashes of lightning. The terrain was treacherous, the ground slick with mud. He stumbled and fell several times, but he kept getting up, driven by a force stronger than fear. He knew that every second counted. The dam could burst at any moment, unleashing its deadly cargo upon Santa Maria. He had to reach the spillway, set the explosives, and pray that his plan would work. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The weight of the village rested on his shoulders. He just hoped that he would be strong enough to carry it. His redemption depended on it. The climb was brutal. The mountain was unforgiving, a jagged landscape of rocks and ravines. The storm showed no signs of relenting, the wind and rain conspiring to push him back, to force him to abandon his mission. Every step was a struggle, every breath a victory. His muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned, but he pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope. He imagined the faces of the villagers, their lives depending on his success. He reached the base of the dam, a colossal wall of concrete looming above him. The sight was terrifying. Water poured over the top in a thundering cascade, a stark reminder of the immense power he was up against. He knew he couldn't waste any time trying to reason with anyone. He was alone. He had to rely on his instincts, his skills, his determination. He followed a narrow, winding path along the side of the mountain towards the location of the abandoned spillway. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for a single person. One wrong step and he would plunge into the raging torrent below. He reached the entrance to the spillway, a gaping hole in the rock face, partially blocked by debris and overgrown with vegetation. It was exactly as he remembered it from the blueprints, a testament to the ambition and ultimately the failure of a previous generation. The entrance was barely visible in the storm. He began to clear away the debris, his hands raw and bleeding. He worked feverishly, driven by a sense of urgency. He had to clear the entrance before the dam burst. As he worked, he could hear the creaking and groaning of the dam, the sound of concrete straining under immense pressure. It was a sound that sent shivers down his spine. He knew that time was running out. He finally cleared the entrance, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel leading into the heart of the mountain. He peered inside, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, and the silence was deafening. He felt a sense of isolation, of being completely cut off from the world. He knew that he was taking a huge risk, venturing into the unknown, but he had no choice. He had to try, he had to save Santa Maria. He was their only hope. And so he pushed forward deeper into the darkness towards his destiny. He knew in his heart that this was what he was meant to do. He just hoped he would live long enough to see it through. The storm raged on outside, the mountain held its breath, and Creekwater Jack pressed onward, alone against the fury of nature. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Water dripped from the ceiling, forming puddles on the uneven floor. He could hear the scurrying of rats, the echo of their tiny claws against the stone. He moved deeper into the mountain, his only light the beam of his flashlight. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinth of forgotten passages. He consulted the tattered blueprint he had brought with him, trying to navigate the maze. He reached a section where the tunnel had partially collapsed, blocking his path. He had to clear the debris, a pile of rocks and rubble that seemed insurmountable. He set down his bag and began to dig, his muscles aching with exhaustion. He worked tirelessly, driven by the knowledge that every minute counted. He dug with the pickaxe, he shoveled with the shovel, he hauled rocks with his bare hands. The sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he cleared the blockage. He squeezed through the narrow opening and continued on his way. The tunnel sloped downwards, leading him deeper into the mountain. He reached the end of the tunnel, a solid wall of rock. This was it, the point where he had to set the explosives. He took a deep breath and surveyed the scene. The rock face was solid, but there were cracks and fissures that he could exploit. He carefully placed the dynamite charges, packing them tightly into the crevices. He connected the blasting caps, making sure everything was secure. He attached the detonator, his hands trembling with anticipation. This was the moment of truth. One wrong move and everything would be lost. He took a final look at the charges, making sure everything was in place. He double-checked the detonator, making sure it was properly connected. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He thought of the villagers of Santa Maria, their faces filled with hope. He thought of his past, the mistakes he had made, the wrongs he had committed. He opened his eyes, his gaze resolute. He was ready. He had come too far to turn back now. He pressed the detonator. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. Still nothing. His heart sank. Had the detonator failed? Had all his efforts been in vain? He cursed his luck, his stupidity, his past. Then, with a deafening roar, the mountain exploded. The explosion rocked the mountain, sending tremors through the ground. Jack was thrown backwards, slamming against the tunnel wall. Debris rained down around him, filling the air with dust and smoke. He coughed and sputtered, trying to clear his lungs. He could barely see, barely breathe. Had he succeeded? Had he managed to blast open the spillway? Or had he simply destroyed himself in a futile attempt to save the village? He stumbled to his feet, his body aching, his head spinning. He had to get out of the tunnel, had to see what had happened. He stumbled back towards the entrance, his progress slow and unsteady. He emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the sudden light. The storm was still raging, but the air seemed clearer, the sky a little brighter. He looked towards the dam, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw took his breath away. A massive torrent of water was gushing out of the side of the mountain, cascading down the hillside in a thunderous roar. The spillway was open. He had done it, but his relief was short-lived. He realized that the explosion had weakened the dam even further. Cracks were spreading across its surface, and large chunks of concrete were breaking away. The dam was about to collapse. He had diverted some of the water, but not enough. The remaining water would still overwhelm Santa Maria. He had to do something more, something drastic. He looked around, his mind racing. He needed a way to warn the villagers, to give them more time to escape. He spotted a pile of discarded lumber near the entrance to the tunnel. An idea formed in his mind, a crazy, desperate idea. He gathered the lumber and began to build a makeshift raft. It was a flimsy structure, barely capable of supporting his weight, but it was the best he could do. He lashed the lumber together with rope, working feverishly against the clock. He finished the raft just as the dam began to crumble. He could hear the groaning and cracking of the concrete, the sound of the mountain tearing itself apart. He knew that he had only moments left. He pushed the raft into the torrent of water gushing from the spillway. He climbed aboard, his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to embark on a suicidal journey, a desperate attempt to save the village. He pushed off from the shore, and the raft was swept away by the raging current. He was tossed and turned, battered and bruised, but he held on tight, determined to reach Santa Maria. He was Creekwater Jack, and he was riding the flood. He hoped he would be able to warn the village in time. The dam was collapsing behind him. He had to hurry. The raft bucked and plunged, a tiny speck of wood against the overwhelming power of the flood. Jack clung on for dear life, his knuckles white, his body battered by the relentless force of the water. He could see Santa Maria in the distance, a cluster of lights barely visible through the storm. He had to reach them, had to warn them before it was too late. He cupped his hands around his mouth and Santa Maria, get to higher ground, the dam is collapsing. His voice was hoarse, barely audible above the roar of the flood, but he kept shouting, his lungs burning, his throat raw. He saw figures moving on the hills, their faces illuminated by the flickering lights of their homes. They had heard him. They were still moving, still climbing, but would it be enough? The raft was swept closer to the village, carried by the relentless current. He could see the houses now, their adobe walls crumbling under the force of the water. He saw people clinging to rooftops, their faces etched with terror. The flood hit Santa Maria with a vengeance, but it wasn't as devastating as it could have been. The spillway had diverted a significant portion of the water, lessening the impact. The houses were damaged, some were destroyed, but the village was still standing. He saw old man Rodriguez standing on the highest point in the village, his arms raised in the air, his face turned towards the heavens. He was praying, thanking God for their salvation. The raft crashed into a large tree, throwing Jack into the churning water. He struggled to stay afloat, his body battered and bruised. He was exhausted, barely able to move. He felt himself being swept away towards the edge of the village, towards the open fields. He closed his eyes, resigned to his fate. He had done everything he could. He had saved Santa Maria. Then he felt a strong hand grab his arm, pulling him towards safety. He opened his eyes and saw a familiar face, the face of Miguel, one of the younger villagers. "Creekwater Jack," Miguel shouted above the roar of the flood. "Hold on. We'll get you out of here." Other villagers rushed to help, pulling him from the water, carrying him towards higher ground. He was safe. He had survived. He looked back at Santa Maria, the village he had saved. The floodwaters were receding, the storm was beginning to subside. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a golden light on the ravaged landscape. He saw the villagers gathered together, their faces filled with gratitude and relief. They were safe thanks to him. He had finally found his redemption. He had finally earned their trust. He closed his eyes, a tear rolling down his cheek. It was a tear of relief, of gratitude, of redemption. He had come to Santa Maria seeking anonymity, seeking escape from his past. But he had found something more, something he never thought possible, a place to belong. He woke up in old man Rodriguez's house, lying on a cot near the fireplace. The room was warm and cozy, filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Old man Rodriguez sat beside him, his weathered face etched with a smile. "Welcome back, Jack," he said, his voice raspy but kind. "You gave us quite a scare." Jack sat up, his body aching all over. "How is the village?" he asked. "Damaged, but we will rebuild," old man Rodriguez replied. "Thanks to you we are alive. You saved us, Jack. You are a hero." Jack shook his head. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said. "No, Jack," old man Rodriguez said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Not anyone, only you. You risked your life for us knowing that we didn't trust you. That takes courage, Jack." "That takes heart." He had a cup of warm tea, and old man Rodriguez explained what had happened after he was rescued. The villagers had worked together to repair the dam, reinforcing the cracks with rocks and concrete. They had also started to clean up the village, salvaging what they could from the wreckage. The storm had passed, but its effects would be felt for a long time. But the villagers were resilient, their spirits unbroken. They would rebuild Santa Maria, stronger than before. As the days passed, Jack helped with the cleanup efforts. He used his engineering skills to repair the irrigation systems, to restore the flow of water to the fields. He worked alongside the villagers, sharing their burdens, earning their respect. He was no longer Creekwater Jack the outlaw. He was just Jack, one of them, a member of the community. He had finally found his place to belong. He often stood by the river, watching the water flow. He no longer saw the ghosts of his past. He saw only the future, a future filled with hope and purpose. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. One evening, as the sun was setting, Miguel approached him. "Jack," he said, "the village wants to thank you. We want to give you something to show our gratitude." He led Jack to the center of the village, where the villagers had gathered. They presented him with a gift, a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Jack Stone, Savior of Santa Maria." Jack was overcome with emotion. He had never received such a gift before. He had never felt so loved, so accepted. He looked at the villagers, their faces beaming with smiles. He knew that he had finally found his home. He had finally found his redemption. He had finally become the man he was meant to be, and he was thankful for the experience. He was a new man. The morning after the flood, the sun rose in a clear, blue sky as if the storm had never happened. But the scars were everywhere, houses damaged, fields flooded, trees uprooted. But the spirit of the village was alive, unbroken. Jack stood on the banks of the river, watching the water recede. He was still injured, his body bruised and aching, but his heart was at peace. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. He had saved Santa Maria, and in doing so, he had saved himself. The villagers were busy cleaning up the debris, repairing their homes, and tending to their fields. They worked together side by side, their faces filled with determination. They were a resilient people, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of the flood. Old man Rodriguez walked over to Jack, his face etched with a smile. "The dam will need to be rebuilt," he said. "It is too dangerous to leave it like this." "I can help with that," Jack said. "I know the area and I have the skills." "We would be honored to have your help," Old man Rodriguez replied. "You are one of us now, Jack. You are part of Santa Maria." Jack smiled. He had finally found a place to belong, a place to call home. He was no longer Creekwater Jack, the notorious outlaw. He was just Jack Stone, the savior of Santa Maria. As the days passed, the villagers worked together to rebuild the dam, reinforcing it with rocks and concrete. Jack used his engineering skills to design a new spillway, one that would be safer and more efficient. The work was hard, but the villagers persevered. They knew that they were building something important, something that would protect them from future floods. They were building a future for themselves, a future filled with hope and security. As the dam was nearing completion, a group of strangers rode into Santa Maria. They were lawmen, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the village. Jack recognized them immediately. They were the men who had been hunting him for years, the men who had branded him an outlaw. He braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. He knew that he had to face the consequences of his past. The lawmen approached him, their hands resting on their guns. "Jackson Stone," the leader said, his voice cold and stern, "you are under arrest." The villagers stepped forward, their faces resolute. Old man Rodriguez raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "These men are mistaken," he said, his voice strong and clear. "This man is not an outlaw, he is a hero. He saved our village." "He may have saved you, but he is still a wanted criminal," the leader of the lawmen replied. "We have a warrant for his arrest." "That warrant means nothing here," Miguel said, stepping forward. "He is one of us. We will not let you take him." The other villagers nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They formed a protective circle around Jack, their bodies a barrier between him and the lawmen. The lawmen looked at the villagers, their faces hardening. They were outnumbered, outgunned. They knew that they couldn't take Jack without a fight, and they weren't willing to risk a bloodbath. The leader of the lawmen hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "We'll be back," he said, his voice menacing. "This isn't over." The lawmen turned and rode away, leaving the villagers standing guard over Jack. Jack was overwhelmed with gratitude. He had never experienced such loyalty, such selflessness. He had finally found a place where he belonged, a place where he was loved and accepted. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Old man Rodriguez replied. "You have already shown us what you are made of." The villagers gathered around him, their faces beaming with smiles. They patted him on the back, shook his hand, and offered words of encouragement. He was no longer Creekwater Jack, the notorious outlaw. He was just Jack Stone, the savior of Santa Maria, a hero in their eyes. As the days passed, Jack continued to help with the rebuilding efforts. He worked alongside the villagers, sharing their burdens, earning their respect. He was a changed man, his past crimes overshadowed by his selfless act. He had finally found redemption, and he was determined to make the most of his second chance. He often stood by the river, watching the water flow. He no longer saw the ghosts of his past. He saw only the future, a future filled with hope and purpose. He was grateful for the life he had been given, and he was determined to live it to the fullest. He was finally free, and Santa Maria, the village that had once feared him, now embraced him as one of their own, a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They were all a family. And they would always have his back. He knew then that his life had come full circle. He had started as an outlaw, a man on the run from the law, but he had ended as a hero, a man loved and respected by his community. It was a transformation he never thought possible, but it was a transformation he would cherish for the rest of his days. He was home. Years passed. Santa Maria flourished. The new dam stood strong, a testament to the resilience of the villagers and the engineering skills of Jack Stone. The fields were fertile, the harvests bountiful. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing through the valley. Jack remained in Santa Maria, his past a distant memory. He was no longer haunted by the ghosts of Creekwater Jack. He was just Jack Stone, the man who understood water, the man who had saved their village. He married Maria, a beautiful young woman with a kind heart and a gentle spirit. They built a small adobe house near the river where they raised a family of their own. He taught his children about the importance of water, about the power of nature, about the value of community. He told them stories of the flood, of the storm, of the day he became a hero. He never spoke of his past, but his children knew. They knew that he had been an outlaw, a man who had made mistakes. But they also knew that he was a good man, a man who had found redemption. The lawmen never returned to Santa Maria. They knew that they would never be able to take Jack without a fight, and they weren't willing to risk another confrontation. Jack lived a long and happy life, surrounded by his family and friends. He was respected and loved by all who knew him. He was a pillar of the community, a symbol of hope and resilience. He often sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. He was grateful for the life he had been given, and he was determined to make the most of every moment. He had come to Santa Maria seeking anonymity, seeking escape from his past. But he had found something more, something he never thought possible, a place to belong, a family to love, and a purpose to live for. He was no longer Creekwater Jack, the notorious outlaw. He was just Jack Stone, the savior of Santa Maria, a hero in the eyes of his community, a man who had found his redemption. And as the years turned into decades, the story of Jack Stone became a legend, a tale told and retold around campfires, a reminder that even the most hardened of criminals can find redemption, that even the darkest of pasts can be touched by the light of hope. And so, years later, an old man stood by the river that had once threatened to destroy everything he held dear. The lines on his face told a story of hardship and redemption, of loss and love. His eyes, once haunted by the darkness of his past, now sparkled with a gentle light, reflecting the peace he had finally found. He was no longer Creekwater Jack, the notorious outlaw. He was just Jack Stone, a man who had made mistakes, a man who had learned from those mistakes, a man who had found his place in the world. He looked towards the mountains, their peaks shrouded in a soft, golden haze. He remembered the storm, the flood, the desperate journey to the dam. He remembered the fear, the exhaustion, the determination. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. He had saved Santa Maria, and in doing so, he had saved himself. The river flowed peacefully, its waters reflecting the clear blue sky. The birds sang sweetly, their melodies filling the air. The sun warmed his skin, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. He was at peace. He had found his purpose. He was home. He opened his eyes and smiled, a smile that reached all the way to his soul. He was Jack Stone, the savior of Santa Maria, a legend in his own time, a man who had finally found redemption. He turned and walked towards his house, towards his family, towards the life he had built. He was grateful for every moment, every challenge, every blessing. He knew that his journey was not over. He knew that there would be more challenges to face, more obstacles to overcome, but he was ready. He had the strength of his community, the love of his family, and the peace of his soul. He walked on, his head held high, his heart filled with hope. He was Jack Stone, the savior of Santa Maria, a man who had found his redemption, a man who was finally free. And as he walked, he knew that his story would live on, a testament to the power of the human spirit, a reminder that even the most hardened of criminals can find redemption, that even the darkest of pasts can be touched by the light of hope. He was the legend, he was finally free. He was Jack Stone, he was home.